The father of African nationalism, Nkrumah gave funds to other nationalist movements and preached the message across the continent.
This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then.
Revolutionary greetings, brothers and sisters. I got the honor of giving a detailed account of the concrete efforts of Pan-Africanism that Nkrumah delivered on and the influence on the African world. Kwame Nkrumah was the chief author of exposing neocolonialism that was in Africa and the Caribbean nations. And he was the greatest Pan-Africanist born on the continent. And the reason why I say born on the continent is because there was a man that influenced him, the fancy hat there, the most honorable Marcus Garvey. Since Garvey, many argue that nobody has done more for the freedom of Africa than Nkrumah. In honor of Garvey's inspiration, Nkrumah named the national shipping line of Ghana the Black Star Line, and also the national soccer team as the Black Stars. And the Black Star also appears in the middle of the flag of Ghana as well. As Nkrumah himself said, of all the literature I studied, the book that did more than any other to fire my enthusiasm was The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. Nkrumah was greatly influenced during his stay in America. Pan-African historian John Henry Clark said during Nkrumah's time that the influence of the 10 years he spent in the United States would have a lingering effect on him for the rest of his life. Nkrumah spent his summers in Harlem, a center of black life and thought, and he involved himself in the community. He spent many evenings listening to and arguing with street orators, and according to Clark, these evenings were a vital part of Nkrumah's American education. He was going to a university, the University of the Harlem Streets. This was no ordinary time, and these street speakers were no ordinary men. This is part of the drama on the Harlem streets as a student Nkrumah walked and watched. Nkrumah was also an activist student, organizing a group of expatriate African students in Pennsylvania and building it into the African Students Association of America and Canada, and him becoming president. In America, he met with C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian-born Pan-Africanist, that influenced him and urged Nkrumah to meet another fellow Trinidad-born Pan-Africanist, in George Padmore, as Nkrumah wanted to further his studies in London. So as Nkrumah was going to London, C.L.R. James sent a letter to Padmore saying of Nkrumah, "This young man is coming to you. He is not very bright, but nevertheless, do what you can for him because he is determined to throw Europeans out of Africa." This is one of the key reasons why Nkrumah could relate to the diaspora more than any African leader on the continent at that time. As Malcolm X stated in a speech in Ghana, there is probably no more enlightened leader on the African continent than President Nkrumah because he lived in America. He knows what it's like there. He cannot live in that land as long as he did and not be disillusioned or confused or deceived. Anytime you think that America is the land of the free, you come here and take off your national dress and be mistaken for an American Negro, and you will find out you're not in the land of the free. America is a colonial power.
That's right.
Malcolm was accurate in this because Nkrumah himself said, as the United States grew richer, more powerful and imperialistic, it expanded and extended its influence and control throughout Latin America and the islands of the Caribbean. Its racialism, oppression, and contempt of the peoples of African descent became accepted as the American way of life. In the mid to late 1940s, Nkrumah returned to Ghana, effectively organized the people, and produced a mass political party in the Convention People's Party, and he led the liberation movement in Ghana, which achieved its independence on March 6, 1957. Nkrumah and the independence of Ghana practically spearheaded the independence of several African countries. As Nkrumah states, the fact that Africa has advanced politically more quickly than any other continent in the world is ignored. The independence of Ghana in 1957 opened wide the floodgates of African freedom. Within 4 years, 18 other African countries achieved independence. Now, in just over 10 years, there are over 40. So I just want to give some examples of how Kwame Nkrumah brought Garvey's vision of United Africa one step closer. Nkrumah states, "I have often been accused of pursuing a policy of the impossible, but I cannot believe in the impossibility of achieving African Union any more than I could ever have thought of the impossibility of attaining African freedom. When I returned to West Africa in 1947, it was with the intention of using the Gold Coast as a start-off point for the African independence and unity. I at once made it clear that there would be no meaning of the national independence of Ghana unless it was linked with the total liberation of the African continent. While our independence celebrations were actually taking place, I called for a conference of all the sovereign states of Africa to discuss plans for the future of the continent. The first conference of independent African states met in Accra in April of 1958. There were only 8, namely Egypt, Ghana, Sudan, Libya, Tunisia, Liberia, Morocco, and Ethiopia. Our purpose was to exchange views on the matters of common interest, to explore ways and means of consolidating and safeguarding our independence, to strengthen the economic and cultural ties between our countries. This was a historic occasion. I felt that at last Pan-Africanism had moved to the African continent where it really belonged. Free Africans were actually meeting together in Africa to examine and consider African affairs. Nkrumah really reflected this thinking in drafting of his constitution by stating, "We consider that some of the more revolutionary illustrations of our attachment to the cause of African Union should be embedded in the instrument that governs the country's policy. Hence, in the preamble of our new constitution, there is to be found the statement that we, the people of Ghana, in hope that we may by our actions this day help to further the development of a Union States of Africa, do hereby enact and give to ourselves this constitution, that the Union of Africa should be striven for by every lawful means, and, when attained, should be faithfully preserved, and that the independence of Ghana should not be surrendered or diminished on any grounds other than the furtherance of African unity. This, I believe, is the first time that an independent sovereign state has voluntarily offered to surrender its sovereignty for the sake of unity. It is our fervent hope that other states in Africa will follow suit, and that we need not wait until the entire continent has seen the light of brotherhood. A start can be made with as little as 2, 3, or 4 states willing to submit themselves to a sovereign union. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and some other newly independent African states have made a start by inscribing these ideals in their constitution. It is for others to water this seed of destiny until it flourishes into a glorious tree of union and brotherhood among the African people. The first steps towards African political union was taken on November 1958 with Republic of Guinea to form the nucleus for the African Union states. Then the following year, Liberia joined in July, and later in the year, Mali joined, the motto of independence and unity.
Ghana, Guinea, and Mali formed the Union of African States and established a charter. Nkrumah hoped that this successful pilot scheme would lead to full continental unity. In December of 1960, Emperor Haile Selassie visited Ghana and showed his support of the Union's African states and African solidarity and security. And President Abdullah Osman of Somalia visited Ghana in October 1961 and believed and supported African unity.
Patrice Lumumba, the political leader of the Congo at the time, visited the conference in 1958 and was deeply influenced by Nkrumah's vision for Pan-Africanism. As he stated, the historical conference, which brings us in contact with qualified leaders of all the African countries and entire world, reveals one thing to us. In spite of the frontiers that separate us, in spite of our ethnic difference, we have the same conscience, the same soul which bathes day and night in anguish, the same wish to make Africa independent, free of uncertainty and fear of colonial domination.
After this, a close bond was formed with Lumumba and Nkrumah, and he was basically treated as Nkrumah's adopted son. Ludo Witt explains that it helped develop a Pan-African view which influenced Lumumba's international perspective and necessity of helping other liberation movements in Africa. Nkrumah was instrumental in establishing the Organization of African Unity, which was the precursor for the now African Union. It was established on May 25, 1963 in Ethiopia with 32 signatory governments. Nkrumah initially believed in his aims because it was providing one step closer to completing Garvey's vision of a United States of Africa and Africa for the Africans. Some of the OAU's aims were to defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of African states. The OAU was also dedicated to the eradication of all forms of colonialism and white minority rule, to ensure that all Africans enjoy human rights, and to raise the living standards of all Africans.
But by the time of 1958, the Pan-African activity of Ghana rippled throughout the continent in 1959. New momentum had been given to the African liberation movement. Uprisings broke out in Central and South Africa. Nkrumah wanted to support these liberation movements and thus established the Bureau of African Affairs, staffed by ex-policemen and ex-servicemen. The African Affairs Center was a subdivision of the Bureau, and one of the leading figures was a Guyanese-born Pan-Africanist Ras Makonnen. As he states, Nkrumah believed it should be the government functioning to the support of the liberation movements.
An example of Nkrumah's willingness to unite liberation movements was in South Africa, where Nkrumah and Ras Makonnen initially favored the support of Robert Sobukwe, who headed the Pan-Africanist Congress that was a splinter group of former members of the African National Congress influenced by the teachings of Anton W.E.B. Then afterwards, he saw the importance to unite them by first trying to get the ANC and the PAC to form a government in exile. As the two sides couldn't come to an agreement, Ghana proposed the ANC and PAC to form a united front. As Ras Makonnen said, "We are not trying to dictate how liberation movements should act, but the idea was that Ghana should try to bring them together for unity and strength." And to document just how much the racist settler regime of the South African government feared Pan-Africanism as an ideology can be found in the court hearings to further detain Robert Sobukwe in South Africa as a political prisoner. Senator Fagan states, "Often hear people speak of communism as a cause for our difficulties. There is, however, another movement which requires no less, but in fact even greater attention, that is Pan-Africanism. I'm using this term to indicate the movement which aims at black domination in Africa from the southern border of the Sahara to the southernmost point of the continent, which launches direct attacks on the welfare, the authority, and influence of the white man in an attempt to achieve their object. If it was therefore only communists with whom we had to reckon, then the decisive sharp action would probably have broken their power and afforded us a period of peace and calm. With Pan-Africanism, the positions is however very different. It is spreading like veiled fire among the black races in Africa. It cannot be checked right up to as far as Zambezi. Southern Rhodesia is being threatened, and the flames are already spreading amongst our own Bantu. It is the product of the Pan-Africanist idea. Pan-Africanism cannot be killed by one blow, neither by a series of blows. If we put all the leaders behind bars, others would take their place. If we should rely entirely on force to fight Pan-Africanism, it would be a fight without end. We might win the first round, but there will be a second round. We might win the 10th round, but there will be an 11th round. And in suppressing Pan-Africanism with force, we do not have the support of the Western nations. We are in a morass, and we must support ourselves that we don't sink away. And this very fear of Pan-Africanism is one of the key reasons why the South African government enacted a special law to further detain Robert Sobukwe and to harass and restrict him even until his death. A second example of Nkrumah's support liberation movements in Africa was during the crisis in the Congo while Lumumba was in power. Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and Egypt had placed troops there, but the downside was they were under the control of the United Nations within the Congo. Another example of Nkrumah supporting liberation movements was, in preparation for the Independence War, Amilcar Cabral set up camps in Ghana with the permission of Kwame Nkrumah. Amilcar Cabral led the PAIGC's guerrilla movement in Portuguese Guinea-Bissau against the Portuguese government, which evolved into one of the most successful wars of independence in modern African history. Nkrumah also came in contact with and being impacted by and influenced by other notable African leaders like Tom Mboya, Milton Obote, Robert Mugabe, Jomo Kenyatta, Abdel Nasser, Sekou Touré, and Julius Nyerere. Nkrumah also had deep concerns and was willing to support the liberation movements in the African diaspora. One example is Nkrumah supported the efforts of Dr. Jagan in British Guyana. From 1961 to 1964, Jagan was confronted with a destabilization campaign conducted by the PNC and UF. In addition to domestic opponents of Jagan, an important role was played in the American Institute of Free Labor Development, which was alleged to be a front for the CIA. This CIA-led front maintained anti-Jagan labor leaders on its payroll and a trained staff of 11 activists who were assigned to organize riots and destabilize the Jagan government. Riots and demonstrations against the PPP administration were frequent, and during disturbances in 1962 and 1963, mobs destroyed parts of Georgetown, doing $40 million in damage. Despite the political setback brought about by the British-imposed decision at the November 1963 Constitutional Conference, Dr. Jagan continued his efforts to find a political solution in Guyana. Shortly after the conference concluded, he wrote to Dr. Nkrumah, president of Ghana, urging him to mediate a settlement between the PPP and the PNC. Dr. Nkrumah immediately responded by sending a mission headed by one of his close advisors, Professor W.E.B. And although these issues didn't get fully resolved, this is a perfect example of Pan-Africanism. And this is the type of Pan-Africanism we need, is to have an independent African nation or nations willing to help solve our political conflicts in our regions. And Nkrumah embodied that in this attempt to help Dr. Jagan solve his political crisis in Guyana. Nkrumah also was impacted by and influenced notable African figures and activists in the diaspora like George Padmore, born in Trinidad, was Nkrumah's advisor on African affairs. Ras Makonnen, born in Guyana, served as Nkrumah's director of African Affairs Center. Kwame Ture, born in Trinidad, he was the chief organizer of All African People's Revolutionary Party. Mentored by Kwame Nkrumah, Ture used those ideas in a broader scope involving the entire African diaspora. Maya Angelou, born in America, taught courses in Ghana and was a close associate to Nkrumah. Shirley Graham and W.E.B. Du Bois were also close associates and worked in Nkrumah's government. Amy Ashwood Garvey also met with Nkrumah as well. Nkrumah even enlisted the services of Malcolm X, as Malcolm really felt that at the time his fight was to continue the struggle in the States and promote the need for unity of Africans worldwide. And to understand the impact Nkrumah had on Malcolm can be summed up by Shirley Graham Du Bois, widow of W.E.B. Du Bois, as she states, as Malcolm was leaving Ghana after visiting with President Nkrumah, we warned him that his life would be in danger. But he, Malcolm, smiled a gentle smile and said, "Your president, Osagyefo, has taught me the true meaning and strength of unity. If I can pass this on to my people, if I can show them the way, my life will be but a small price to pay for such a vision." The Gold Coast has been among the wealthiest and most socially advanced areas in Africa, with schools, railways, hospitals, social security, and an advanced economy. After the 10-year development plan, Nkrumah brought forth the second development plan in 1959. This plan called for the development of manufacturing, 600 factories producing 100 varieties of products. Nkrumah's time in office was initially successful. With forestry, fishing, and cattle breeding expanded, production of coca, Ghana's main export, doubled, and modest deposits of bauxite and gold exported more effectively. The construction of a dam on the Vallada River provided water for irrigation and hydroelectric power. The government funds were also provided for village projects in which local people built schools and roads, while free health care and education were introduced. A 7-year plan introduced in 1964 focused on further industrialization, emphasizing domestic substitutes for common imports, modernization of the building materials industry, machine making, electrification, and electronics. Nkrumah was instrumental in helping Ghana become one of the most technologically advanced and progressive countries in Africa. But Nkrumah himself said in his book, Africa Must Unite, "I will not hide the fact that I am impatient when it comes to building Ghana." This impatience did lead to obstacles that Nkrumah and the country found itself in, because Nkrumah did not favor the gradual approach. As he stated in his speech at the Casablanca meeting in 1961 when warning other African leaders, and thus, "What I fear most of all is that if we do not formulate plans and take active steps to form a political union, we will be soon fighting and warring amongst ourselves." And he proved to be correct. Besides independent states, liberation movements, and trade unions, there were other significant sectors that Nkrumah was instrumental in organizing and mobilizing. There were African women, union, educators, farmers, and journalists. One example is the Organization of African Women for African Agency. Much of the success of the Convention People's Party has been due to the efforts of women members. From the very beginning, women have been the chief field organizers. They have traveled through innumerable towns and villages in the role of propaganda secretaries and have been responsible for the most important in bringing about the solidarity and cohesion of the party. The organization and unification of African women was paramount in Nkrumah's execution of the African Revolution. Women were literally the backbone responsible for the CPP's rise to power. It is somewhat symbolic that during the March 1948 police roundup of UGCC leadership, Nkrumah laid low for a while in the house of two women supporters and spent the time planning the development of the Convention People's Party. Once the CPP arrived on the scene, it sought to enfranchise the most oppressed in Ghanaian society in that sector, and according to Nkrumah, that was African women. Another example is the organization of African youth for Pan-African Agency. On a Pan-African scale, Ghana has been accused of encouraging the youth throughout Africa to rebel. This was said to be done through the All-African People's Conference held in Accra in 1958. Rather than being offended, Nkrumah took the accusation as a compliment. Youth were not only addressed in terms of militant liberation or as ideological catalysts, their day-to-day attitudes were also a concern to Nkrumah. He wanted to raise patriotic, responsible, and self-conscious citizens. This quest gave rise to the establishment of the Convention People's Party Student Union at the University College in Accra and the Young Pioneers. And another example is institutions of higher learning. Africanists, institutions of African studies, and the Encyclopedia Africana. The access to education increased vastly across all levels of Nkrumah's governance. Education also developed qualitatively in two ways. First, the general curriculum increased in technical and scientific training. Most importantly, however, education was purposely being designed to enhance Pan-African agency. To facilitate these developments, Nkrumah intervened directly and seized control of Ghana's institutions of higher learning to rout out die-hard colonialist attitudes and practices. He also sponsored the Encyclopedia Africana, the African Studies Institute at the University of Ghana, and the Ideological Institute of W.E.B. As I close, we really need to further the vision of Nkrumah as to act locally, but think and link up globally with our African brothers and sisters. Because otherwise, like Nkrumah stated, neo-colonial forces will pick us off one by one. Our shared history and common experiences rise above our nationalities, religious beliefs, and socio-political affiliations. As Nkrumah states, an important aspect of Pan-Africanism is the revival and development of the African personality, temporarily submerged during the colonial period. It finds its expression in a reawakening consciousness among Africans and the peoples of African descent of the bonds which unite us. Our historical past, our future, our common experience, and our aspirations. Ghana, as Malcolm X said, was the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism, as was a place that Nkrumah encouraged where Africans from around the world had a place and platform to organize and establish links to strengthen African unity inside and outside the continent. Nkrumah showed his concrete support of the liberation movements and newly independent states and political situations in the diaspora. In summarizing Nkrumah's contribution to Pan-Africanism from 1945 to 1966, the attempt here was not to prove uniqueness or even originality, because Nkrumah is not the creator of the ideology, but to prove his effectiveness. In that light, 6 major points can be summarized. Nkrumah linked the traditions of West African nationalism and Pan-African nationalism. As he said, I at once made it clear that there would be no meaning to the national independence of Ghana unless it was linked to the total liberation of the African continent. while our independence celebrations were actually taking place, I called for a conference of all sovereign states of Africa to discuss plans for the future of the continent. And Nkrumah made the necessary steps to make this happen. Nkrumah initiated and developed the first Pan-African liberated state in modern history. To explain this further, for a considerable time, Ethiopia, and to lesser extents Haiti and Liberia, stood as the independent zones of Pan-African support. But these countries did have their restrictions. What sets Ghana apart from those countries is upon Ghana's formal independence, Nkrumah began to use Ghana's treasury to support the African Revolution throughout the world. Ghana became the Mecca of African revolutionaries, as well as others committed to liberation from colonialism and neo-colonialism. Under their charge, Ghana organized conferences, sponsored scholarships, and provided training for freedom fighters. And many of the future heads of states were present in Ghana's sponsored Conference of the All-African Peoples. Nkrumah initiated the first African state-sponsored effort of African-centered research. Nkrumah elevated Pan-African agency to the level of African nation states. Nkrumah developed the concept for Socialist African Union as the optimal level for the African personality, genius, community, and agency. And lastly, Nkrumah offered a formal philosophy to defend the ideology of the African Revolution. Nkrumah articulated a philosophy that explained the many lively forces that occupied a territory, their interrelationships, and the surrogates of their interrelationships. And two quotes I want to leave us with that Nkrumah said: "I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. All people of African descent, whether they live in North or South America, the Caribbean, or in any part of the world, are Africans and belong to the African nation." Thank you for your time.
The forces arrayed against us are, and I use the word most carefully, formidable. They are entrenched and powerful. They are, as I've taken some pains to explain, they operate in worldwide combinations at all levels: political, economic, military, cultural, educational, social, and trade. And not all, and through intelligence, cultural, and information services. They operate from European and African centers, using agents who, I'm ashamed to say, are often unpatriotic sons of Africa, buying personal satisfactions with the betrayal of their country's safety and integrity. They seduce leaders. They seduce leaders of the African political, trade union, and people's organization, thus creating rifts and quarrels within the national front. On the broader front, they are massing their forces in a determined effort to stay the advance of African liberation and the march of unity. They are attempting many methods, some sinister, some beguiling, to wreck our efforts. They strike antipathetic postures. On one side, they perform acts calculated to strike fear. On the other, they try to hoodwink us with fictitious gifts, which superficially pander to our hopes and aspirations. They are the present attempts to deflect our purpose, to weaken our determination.
He has labored, he has suffered to lead his people into the land of freedom. He's the Redeemer and the champion of liberty, of human equality. Let's salute him, fellow Ghanaians, the nation's founder, Osageyfo Kwame Nkrumah. May God bless him, Ghana showboy, Africa's great son, Osageyfo Dr. Nkrumah.
At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. And yet again, I want to take the opportunity to thank the chiefs and people of this country, the youth, the farmers, the women, who have so nobly fought and won this battle.
Land of freedom, toils of the brave, and the sweat of their labors, toils of the brave, which have brought results. Kwame, the star of Ghana, Nkrumah, star of Ghana, everybody toils of the brave, and the sweat of their labors, toils of the brave, which have brought results. Ghana, we now have freedom. Ghana, land of freedom, everybody toils of the brave, and the sweat of their labors, toils of the brave, which have brought results. Gold Coast will thank Nananom and elders, late Gisli Hayford, Mensan Saba, Grant, Sergeant Ajete, and all who fought for freedom. Everybody! Toils of the brave, and the sweat of their labors, toils of the brave, which have brought results.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.